Welcome to Debate Clash. We're dedicated to providing forensics resources to every student that needs them. If you want to learn, you should have the ability to. In this video, we'll be looking at the resolution resolved. On balance, economic sanctions are reducing the threat Russia poses to Western interests. We'll start by defining what the resolution is talking about, and then moving on to some of the major affirmative and negative arguments that you'll be seeing this next month. The first part of the resolution are the words "on balance." Don't let this little phrase confuse or intimidate you. Most people simply use this phrase as a framework argument to say that we should weigh the costs and the benefits before making a conclusion on the topic. The next part of the resolution refers to economic sanctions. I prefer the definition from the Council on Foreign Relations, which says, economic sanctions are defined as the withdrawal of customary trade and financial relations for foreign and security policy purposes. It's a mouthful, but I think it explains economic sanctions exceptionally well. Anytime a nation restricts the way trade is done for a specific purpose, that is an economic sanction. And that is what this definition is proposing. Examples of economic sanctions recently placed on Russia include travel bans, which restrict certain Russian leaders from even entering some countries. The freezing of assets, meaning that certain Russian leaders can't invest or even touch things that they technically own in certain nations. Russian banks can't initiate long-term loans in the EU. EU and Russian arms deals are banned. And there are several other restraints that have also been placed. The next phrase that's crucial to define is reducing the threat. This topic gives you a singular way to win. Prove that Russia is decreasing as a threat or not. You need to give the judge a way to determine that. Is decreasing the likelihood of an attack reducing the threat? What about decreasing their military funding or size of their army? Maybe destabilizing their economy reduces the threat. This needs to be defined so that everyone can be on the same page in the debate round. And finally, we have Western interests. Western society generally refers to European countries or countries with European origin. The thing that isn't so clear is their interests. There are so many interests at play right now. Some would argue that Western society's interests are based upon the promotion of democracy, or maybe they have to deal with security or the economic interests. This will tie in with how you perceive reducing the threat to form your framework for the round. The major affirmative arguments can be classified into three major categories: probability, magnitude, and workarounds. The first argument under this category is the reason economic sanctions exist. They are designed to hurt a country's economy to the point that they can't attack or even support any side in time of war. The affirmative could definitely argue that a financially deprived Russia won't be able to compete economically with the West, repel democratic movements, or maybe attack countries like they did with Ukraine. It decreases the probability that Russia will attack. If you can prove the link that economic sanctions are hurting the Russian economy, which shouldn't be too hard, you have an endless amount of impacts at your disposal. You could also argue that these sanctions decrease the amount of assets that Russian leaders have throughout Europe. If they have less assets, there's also a less likely reason that they'd ever go in to protect them. There is also the argument that Russia is publicly being shown how little allies they actually have. If you don't have allies, you don't engage in conflict. The entire West has sanctioned Russia in one way or another, and as irrational as Russian actions might have seemed in the past, they still analyze the consequences of their actions. If they're going to lose a war, there's no reason for them to start it. The next argument follows the same line of thinking, which is that they really don't have many allies and a lot of the world is against them. If they increase their support for corrupt leaders, or even on the extreme side initiate some kind of hostile or violent act, they know that a large majority of the world will be punishing them either militarily or even harsher through the economic process. One could argue that these sanctions have already stopped Russia from making bigger moves in the Middle East, going further into Ukraine, Georgia, or Moldova. I think the affirmative can also create a lot of ground for themselves by showing the actions that Russia was about to take, but then didn't. Now that is your correlation. If you can prove that they didn't do these actions as a result of economic sanctions, that's your causation, and you'll have a great argument. Magnitude refers to the destructive power of a nation. Now, the first argument under this category is a decreased amount of weapons and military support. CNN last July reported that the Russian military is decreasing the amount of troops they have by 40,000. The reason for this? Budget constraints. All you need to do is show that the economic sanctions that were placed on Russia caused the budget constraints to happen. Another argument you can run is that these sanctions have decreased the amount of allies that Russia has. The first way is that they can't help support their allies in the Middle East, such as Syria or Egypt. Each country that's overthrown is another ally lost. The second way is that economic sanctions have created Russia to be the isolated bad guy in this warlike fairy tale. You could easily make the argument that Russia's power and ability to gain allies is almost non-existent as a result of these economic sanctions, because a large portion of the world has now vowed not to work with them. Aside from potentially militaristic allies, Russia is also losing out on financial allies, and a lot of nations are losing their dependence on Russian commodities. A disconnected economy is a weak economy, and a weak economy brings every sector of your country down. Along this economic train of thought, if Russian banks aren't giving out as many loans, and Russia isn't exporting as much as they once were, not only is Russia's economy getting weaker, but the rest of the world, making up for their shortcomings, are getting stronger. If the rest of the world is getting stronger, that decreases the threat that Russia poses. A key characteristic to any great leader or nation are the patriots that support them. The Russian president, Vladimir Putin, has now objected to working with Western nations. That is what caused these economic sanctions to be put in place. One could argue that at some point citizens and patriots will start losing patience and abandon the loyalty that they once had for Russia. The more divided Russia is, the less of a threat that they pose to the rest of the world. And finally, if we look at Russia, they are somewhat of a mascot against democratic movements. These sanctions have already reduced the amount of support that Russia can give to repel democratic movements. But on top of that, because these economic sanctions have hurt Russia so badly, one could argue that they're creating themselves as a shining example that the system that they promote ultimately ends in failure. I would also highly recommend researching any and all cutbacks that Russia has made recently. Attributing these cutbacks to the economic sanctions could be a great argument for the affirmative. The first workaround is to make the argument that the affirmative doesn't need to prove that economic sanctions are reducing the threat compared to the past, but simply that they're reducing the threat compared to if we didn't initiate sanctions whatsoever. This way, if your opponents pull out evidence saying that Russia has increased funding for nuclear weapons research or funding for extremist organizations, you can respond by saying, yes, that may be true, but in a world where sanctions didn't exist, they would have funneled even more money those ways. As much as they may have spent $10 million supporting extremist organizations, in a world where economic sanctions didn't exist, they might have spent $100 million. This shows that economic sanctions are reducing the threat that Russia would have posed had we not implemented them. I think you can also compare economic sanctions to the options or alternatives that the West has when dealing with Russia. Diplomacy failed a long time ago, as seen by the Russian aggression in Ukraine and their willingness to support corrupt leaders. On the other side of the spectrum, anything to do with boots on the ground or violent interventions would probably escalate the conflict and make Russia just that more aggressive. Sanctions are the perfect middle ground. They are actively reducing the threat that Russia would have posed had we done anything else. If we did nothing, we have an extremely strong Russia. If we sent in troops, we have an extremely aggressive and hostile Russia. Sanctions are the best option that is available to us. The last affirmative workaround you can use relies on your ability to define certain words in the resolution. The easiest is to say if Russia's economy is decreasing, then so is the threat that they pose. After that, you can show how Russia is on the brink of a recession, how their currency has depreciated drastically, how they've put major projects like the South Stream pipeline on hold, or how central Russian banks saw major losses last year, and so on. There are a lot of definitions that you can utilize to give yourself an advantage on this topic. Make sure that if you are basing your entire case off of a definition, that you have plenty of supportive arguments to keep this definition alive so that it can keep the rest of your case alive. The negative arguments can also be classified into the same three categories: probability, magnitude, and workarounds. The first probability argument that you can make is that economic mutually assured destruction, or MAD for short, is taken out of the picture. There is a theory that says if two nations are financially tied together, and there's a lot of trade between the two, that one nation will never initiate war or attack the other, because it will also hurt them. If Nation A attacks Nation B, it will end up hurting Nation B's economy. Now, because they're so intertwined financially, their failing economy results in the failing economy of Nation A as well. Because of this mutually assured destruction, Nation A and Nation B should theoretically never attack each other. Now, these sanctions reduce the amount of economic interdependence between Russia and Western nations. Therefore, if Russia attacked a Western nation, they wouldn't get hurt as much. They're destroying the mutually assured destruction with these economic sanctions. The next argument is that these sanctions will cause Russia to be irrational and desperate. Their economy is going downhill, they are quickly losing allies, and at some point Russia is going to realize that they don't want to sit in the back seat while the West controls them. The issue of diplomacy failure also exists. If we need to sign a new economic, environmental, or nuclear deal, the likelihood that Russia will sign on is very low because of these economic sanctions. Economic sanctions are as far as you can go without actually sending troops into the nation. The West sanctions are outright acts of hostility, and there is no reason that Russia would ever want to work with us. Utilizing the link of Russia not wanting to work with the West can be mutated into almost any impact or argument that you want. Give some examples of treaties, policies, or alliances that might come up that Russia won't sign on to, and you will be on your merry way. These sanctions also give Russia a very clear and distinct reason to fight against democratic movements. It's apparent that Western democratic states do not get along with Russia. Therefore, Russia should be making every conceivable move possible to repel the democratic movements that are taking place right now. This point will definitely require some research, but you have Russia's motive. If you can find under-the-table deals that Russia has been doing with extremist organizations or anything to repel the democratic movements, it'll be a great argument. I think researching into the militaristic moves that Russia has taken after the sanctions have already been initiated could give you some great insight and help solidify the idea that economic sanctions are not working. Any moves that you find are not futuristic or anticipated decisions that Russia might make. They are empirical decisions that show Russia's unwillingness to even listen to the West's sanctions. The first argument that the negative can make is that the West is treating Russia like the little kid on the playground, that they are bullying them. Russia can easily use the actions that the West is taking on them to show how hostile and horrible Western ideals are. The impacts that the negative can foster off of this argument are that this might unite Russia since they now have a common enemy, that this could be used as propaganda against democratic movements, or without Russia even having to mention it, that extremist organizations could use this as a recruitment tool to show that the West is horrible. These sanctions could also draw Russia closer to China. Democracy is rising in the Middle East. The West is sanctioning nations that disagree with their political ideals. There really is not a better time for Russia and China to form a non-Western pact. The sanctions that also place a restriction on Russia selling weapons to Europe could also be fairly troublesome. A CNN article last year found that Russia exports over $13 billion worth of arms every year. They are the second biggest supplier of arms in the entire world, right after the United States. Russia's two biggest clients are China and India, but they were still exporting a significant amount of arms over to Europe. Since this financial tie is now cut off, Russia may be selling arms to enemies of the West, making them an even bigger threat. The final argument is that we don't know much about what they're doing anymore. Because we've stopped working with them as much, our intelligence on them has also decreased. An unknown threat is a big threat. The first negative workaround that you can utilize is to force the affirmative into proving that the threat that Russia poses is actively decreasing, not just that it's been decreasing in the past. Just because sanctions worked a year ago or even a month ago does not mean that they are actively working, and it doesn't prove the resolution to be true. If you have some hefty research skills and can create a case that exclusively relies on evidence found in the last month, this could be a great route for you to take. Another workaround that you can make is that it's an external force. It's not the economic sanctions that are reducing the threat that Russia poses. Middle Eastern democratic movements that are causing Russia to lose allies arguably have nothing to do with economic sanctions. So yes, Russia may be reducing as a threat, but that's a result of Middle Eastern democratic movements, a result of oil prices tanking, or other treaties or policies that have been formed on the global level. It's not as a result of economic sanctions. This would force the affirmative into defending not only that the threat of Russia is decreasing, but they also have to prove that it's exclusively due to economic sanctions. If you want to start brainstorming for these type of arguments, go ahead and take a look at some of the agreements, some treaties, or other global events that happened this last summer. You could also argue in the framework that it's not the negative's burden to prove that Russia will attack or that they are building up militarily, but simply that it's either staying the same or that there's a higher possibility of an attack, or their military is a little bit scarier than it used to be. If it's neutral, the ballot goes for the negative. You can also brainstorm with the utilization of alternatives to economic sanctions. You can say that they aren't reducing the threat compared to alternative means. One could also go for the defensive argument that these sanctions have done such an insignificant value to the Russian economy that they haven't done much, that they didn't actually force anything to take place. If you look back to 2007 and 2008, Russia was much worse off, and that was without the sanctions being in place. The first tip I have is to know your recent Russian history. Know what happened in Ukraine, maybe even look up a timeline. Know Russia's involvement in the Middle East. The more you know, the better you'll do. The second tip I have is to be specific. It's not enough to say Russia is decreasing their military or Russia will be intervening in the Middle East. Say why they will be doing each action. What specific country are they going into? What weapons are they decreasing militarily? And what is causing all of this to happen? Specificity on this topic will throw your opponent off while painting a beautiful picture for the judge. The third tip I have is to be prepared for the definition debate. Every word, every phrase, The last tip that I have for you is to prove causation, not correlation. Everything needs to come back to economic sanctions and how they exclusively either reduce or enhance the threat that Russia poses. Thank you for watching. Please share this video with your friends, subscribe to our YouTube channel, or let your debate coach know that this is a great resource to show in class. Good luck at the next tournament, and good luck with your research.